The 9-mile coastline of Southern California, known as Palos Verdes, is home to some of Los Angeles' wealthiest families. It's hardly the place you'd expect a true Cold War espionage story to begin. Yet it was here that two childhood friends, Christopher John Boyce and Andrew Dalton Lee, met and abandoned their privileged lives to betray their country. Together, they plunged into the dangerous world of espionage. Their story is a blend of misguided ideals, greed, hedonism, and recklessness, ultimately exposing a shocking national security breach that left a lasting mark on Cold War history. This is the story of the Falcon and the Snowman. In the world of espionage and intelligence, secrecy is paramount. And in our digital world, online privacy should be too. When browsing the web unprotected, your device transmits data you're unaware of, which can be seen and stolen by anyone. That's why you need today's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Private Internet Access protects your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel, hiding your IP address and shielding your digital life. It protects me from hackers, ISPs, and others, even on public Wi-Fi. And it can do the same for you. PIA is the world's most transparent VPN with over 30 million downloads. They have a strict no-logs policy, meaning PIA doesn't store any records of your internet activity. One subscription protects unlimited devices across all major platforms, keeping your entire household digitally secure. Beyond security, PIA offers other benefits. Before making this video, I wanted to watch the 1985 film The Falcon and the Snowman, but it wasn't available to stream in the UK on Tubi TV. This is where Private Internet Access came to the rescue, allowing me to connect to a US server and watch the film without being blocked by geographic restrictions. My channel viewers get an 83% discount plus 4 months free, costing just $2.30 a month. It's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. Click the link in the description to claim this deal. Thank you to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. Personal backgrounds of Boyce and Lee. Christopher John Boyce. Christopher John Boyce, the eldest of 9 siblings, was born on February 16, 1953. He grew up in a family where patriotism and Catholicism were pillars of daily life. His father, Charles Boyce, was a former FBI agent turned corporate security executive in the aerospace industry. Chris excelled academically with an IQ of 142 and displayed natural leadership, winning election as 8th grade class president. But his true passion as a young boy was falconry. His father gifted him a book on the subject, and after a family friend who owned a falcon demonstrated its flight, Chris was hooked. By age 14, he earned a Master Falconer certification, spending countless hours in the rugged canyons around Palos Verdes, trapping and training birds of prey. Andrew Dalton Lee. In contrast, Andrew Dalton Lee entered the world under different circumstances. Born on January 3, 1952, he was adopted by Dr. Dalton Bradley Lee, a successful pathologist and decorated World War II pilot, and his wife, Anne. Andrew preferred to be called Dalton after his adoptive father. Unlike Chris, Dalton struggled academically and socially. He seemed to stop growing in 5th grade, standing at just 5'2", with severe acne that added to his teenage insecurities. While Chris naturally commanded respect, Dalton fought to gain attention through increasingly desperate measures over time. Their friendship. The two boys met while serving as altar boys at St. John Fisher Catholic Church, and their friendship grew stronger during their high school years at Palos Verdes High, where both played football for the Sea Kings. What truly cemented their bond was their shared love for falconry. One day, Dalton showed off the owl's hawks, and falcons he kept at his home near the family's golf course. From then on, Chris and Dalton became best friends. But as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, societal upheaval began to crack the foundation of their privileged world. The Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal created fissures in American society, reaching even the insulated community of Palos Verdes. Chris, initially a staunch supporter of the war effort, began questioning everything he had been taught about American righteousness. Trips to rural Mexico with his family exposed him to abject poverty, starkly contrasting his comfortable life. The cognitive dissonance was jarring for a young man raised with absolute moral imperatives. Dalton's rebellion took a more direct path through drugs. Southern California high schools were flooded with marijuana and even cocaine by the early 1970s, and Dalton embraced both enthusiastically. Drugs gave him something he had never had: social currency. Girls who once ignored the short, awkward teenager with bad skin suddenly sought him out when he offered free samples. By his senior year, Dalton discovered that drug dealing not only brought attention and romantic perks, but also serious money. Under Dalton's influence, Chris's grades slipped from excellent to average. His concerned parents transferred him to Rolling Hills High School, hoping distance would break the destructive dynamic of their friendship. But their bond forged in the wilderness with hawks and falcons proved stronger than parental intervention. After graduation, both young men were adrift. Dalton dropped out of community college within months, fully embracing drug dealing as a career. By 1973, he was moving large quantities of marijuana and cocaine, earning $1,000 to $2,000 a week, and his reputation grew as a connector to serious dealers in Mexico. Chris struggled to find direction. Mononucleosis delayed his college enrollment, and he bounced between 3 different schools. He briefly considered becoming a priest, but after a year at Loyola University in 1972, he suffered a crisis of faith and dropped out. When a federal grant to study falconry history at California Polytechnic State University was denied, even his passion seemed to offer no clear path. By early 1974, Chris was floundering. In June, his father, Charles Boyce, used his aerospace industry connections to secure his son a temporary job at TRW, a major defense contractor based in Redondo Beach. Chris saw it as a stopgap while he figured out his future. Starting as a general clerk at $140 a week, his intelligence and work ethic impressed his superiors. By August, Chris was considered for a higher responsibility role, requiring a secret security clearance. His background check raised no red flags, and his admission of occasional marijuana use wasn't enough to cause alarm. Unbeknownst to Chris at the time, he was being groomed for an assignment involving one of America's most closely guarded secrets. The Rhyolite system was a sophisticated network of surveillance satellites designed to collect electronic intelligence from space. These black satellites could eavesdrop on phone conversations, intercept microwave transmissions, and photograph military installations with extraordinary clarity. The primary targets were missile launch sites in China and the Soviet Union. While still a private contractor employee at TRW, his salary would be paid by the CIA. Chris's new workplace was the Black Vault, a secure communications hub linking TRW with CIA headquarters in Langley and Pine Gap, a joint U.S.-Australian satellite intelligence and surveillance facility near Alice Springs, Australia. Each morning, he would pass multiple security checkpoints, deactivate alarms, and open a safe containing the day's encryption codes for the secure teletype machine. His responsibilities included handling overnight messages from Langley and distributing copies to specific TRW and CIA officials. One of the first things that shocked Chris in his new role was the lax security in this highly classified environment. He observed colleagues regularly smuggling alcohol into the facility in briefcases, treating the vault like a non-stop cocktail bar. But it was the content of the communications that truly unsettled him. He discovered the CIA was actively infiltrating Australian labor unions and fomenting opposition against the left-leaning Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, funding opposition parties to overthrow him. Most shocking to Chris was learning that much of the intelligence collected was deliberately withheld from Australia, despite an agreement that all satellite intelligence would be shared with the Australian government. TRW was even designing a more advanced satellite system called Argus, which the Australians knew nothing about. Why was the CIA seeking to interfere in Australian politics? In short, the US disliked Gough Whitlam's left-leaning policies. Whitlam had withdrawn Australian troops from Vietnam and publicly criticized US bombings in Hanoi in 1973. There were concerns that his government might expose the true function of secret US bases in Australia, which had never been publicly acknowledged. Pine Gap was critical to US intelligence collection, and they couldn't risk Whitlam terminating its operational agreement. There were also worries that a left-leaning government would be more vulnerable to KGB infiltration. Moreover, the spy satellites weren't just targeting Cold War enemies like China and the Soviet Union, but also surveilling US allies, including Israel, Japan, and France. Chris believed this went too far and couldn't be justified as protecting US national security. The corporate military intelligence complex his workplace represented seemed to him riddled with hypocrisy and jingoistic nonsense. For a young man already disillusioned by events like the Vietnam War and Watergate, what he saw as the betrayal of allies and treaty obligations felt like a moral rot at the heart of American power. Chris's frustration deepened through 1974 and into 1975. At weekend parties loosened by alcohol and cocaine, he began sharing details of his work with Dalton. He spoke of the CIA's deception, the lax security in the Black Vault, and his growing contempt for the entire operation. Meanwhile, Dalton's legal and financial troubles were mounting. His $500 drug habit led to multiple arrests. He had violated probation terms repeatedly and faced the prospect of serious prison time. One evening, Chris made a fateful suggestion to Dalton. Why not sell classified information to a foreign government? The idea stemmed from Chris's desire to wage what he later called a one-man war against the government he had come to despise. For him, it was a form of protest, a way to strike back at a hypocritical system. For Dalton, dollar signs surely appeared in his eyes. He saw this as the big score he needed to resolve his drug and legal troubles. Dalton could hardly believe what his lifelong friend was suggesting. Espionage was a step above drug dealing. But as his court date approached and prison loomed, the idea became enticing. In early April 1975, just days before his scheduled trial, Dalton fled to Mexico City. With that, the espionage game began. Espionage activities. Dalton's approach to Soviet intelligence in April 1975 was straightforward. He simply walked into the Soviet embassy, declared he had top-secret information about US spy satellites, and demanded to speak to someone in charge. Minutes later, he was sitting across from KGB agent Vasily Ivanovich Okana. Coached by Chris, Dalton introduced himself as a courier for an anonymous US government employee with socialist leanings. To prove his access, He provided computer cards and teletype documents from TRW's encryption system that Chris had smuggled out of the facility. O'Connor, initially skeptical, seemed impressed by Dalton's rudimentary technical knowledge. They arranged a follow-up meeting, and Dalton left with $250 to cover expenses. That evening, Dalton called Chris from a payphone in Hermosa Beach. Their plan was taking shape and was now something real. Through the rest of 1975 and into 1976, a steady stream of classified documents flowed from Chris's position in the Black Vault to Dalton's Soviet contacts in Mexico City. Encryption cards, rhyolite message copies, and technical documents were exchanged for increasingly larger payments. The Soviets provided Dalton with a sophisticated system for scheduling meetings using postcards and tape markers on lampposts at Mexico City intersections. To evade his growing legal troubles, Dalton assumed a false identity as Theodore Philip Love Lance, using information from a deceased person to obtain a California driver's license. This allowed him to move freely between Mexico and the U.S., while technically a fugitive from American justice. As the operation matured, Soviet demands escalated. They wanted satellite transmission frequencies and photographs of the rhyolite and Argus payloads, the actual satellite hardware containing the sophisticated surveillance equipment that made the spy satellites so valuable. These payloads housed sensitive receivers, transmitters, and imaging equipment that enabled the satellites to intercept communications and capture detailed images from space. In March 1976, Dalton traveled to Vienna for advanced espionage training. During this trip, the Soviets provided him with specialized photographic equipment and training in covert communication techniques. Despite the professional guidance, the photos Dalton later provided were consistently poor quality, often blurry images of irrelevant subjects or compromising nude photos of women he took for personal reasons. While his handler remained optimistic about the partnership's potential, cracks began to show. Fueled by alcohol and cocaine during Vienna meetings, Dalton drunkenly revealed Christopher Boyce's full name to his handler, Mazanov. Meanwhile, Chris grew increasingly frustrated with what he suspected was Dalton's financial manipulation. Dalton kept about $4 for every dollar he passed to Chris, using most of the money to feed his growing heroin addiction. By late 1976, the partnership was deteriorating rapidly. Chris, who viewed the stolen secrets more as tools of protest than profit, was disgusted by Dalton's greed and recklessness. Frustrated with his unreliable partner, Chris bypassed Dalton entirely and established direct contact with the KGB. The Soviets were displeased with the direct approach and Chris's unilateral decision to cut out the courier. The confrontation climaxed in October 1976, when Chris insisted on accompanying Dalton to Mexico City. At the Soviet embassy, they were escorted to a basement meeting room where the two Americans were initially greeted with drinks and apparent enthusiasm. But things soured when Chris had to explain that the mission to obtain satellite frequencies the Soviets requested was impossible. That information was held by the NSA and Western Union, not TRW. The mood of the KGB officers darkened significantly. When Dalton, in his usual inebriated state, began complaining about a promised apartment in Puerto Vallarta, a KGB officer placed a pistol on the table. Clearly, the Soviets had had enough, and the message was unmistakable. As Dalton left the room, Chris delivered the fatal blow to their partnership. He told the KGB that Dalton was a heroin addict and even threatened to expose the operation to his FBI father. They agreed that Dalton needed to be cut out of the picture entirely. The KGB then made a proposal revealing the true scope of their ambitions for Chris. They were thinking long-term. They wanted Chris to quit TRW, enroll in college with Soviet funding, and eventually secure a job at the CIA or State Department. He would become a deep-cover mole, potentially providing intelligence for decades. From his seat in the dimly lit basement of the Soviet embassy in Mexico, it was an offer Chris could hardly refuse, even if he wanted to. And so, Christopher Boyce returned to California and began preparing applications for the University of California, Riverside. He focused on courses that would position him for a career in intelligence or diplomacy before leaving TRW in mid-December 1976. He stole a large file on Project Pyramid, a proposed satellite system marked top secret, but carelessly left in an unsecured cabinet. These documents would be Chris's parting gift to the Soviets before transitioning to his new role as a deeply concealed sleeper asset. After the October meeting in Mexico City, Dalton had returned to Mazatlan when he attempted to schedule another meeting in early November, placing the agreed-upon signal on a Mexico City lamppost. No Soviet handler showed up. Ignoring all prior warnings about embassy security, Dalton walked straight into the Soviet compound, demanding to see his KGB handler, Boris Grishin. Grishin was furious. He called Dalton's documents worthless and berated him for failing to follow explicit instructions. Two drivers pulled the protesting American into a limousine and dumped him on a cobblestone street miles from the embassy. The message couldn't have been clearer, but Dalton persisted, if nothing else. Against his better judgment, Chris agreed to let Dalton act as a courier one last time so he could sell the Project Pyramid documents to the Soviets. Dalton must have been thrilled. He believed the information could fetch up to $75,000 from the Soviets, enough for a one-way ticket to Costa Rica and a fresh start far from his legal troubles. With a trial scheduled for January 20th, 1977, the stage was set for the final act of this now amateurish espionage drama. On the morning of January 6, 1977, Andrew Dalton Lee strolled casually toward the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. What he didn't know was that Mexican police had heightened surveillance of the embassy following the murder of a policeman by a Mexican Marxist terrorist group the previous week. At 11:00 a.m., Dalton nonchalantly tossed an object over the embassy's security gate. Surveillance officers immediately surrounded him, demanding an explanation in rapid Spanish. Initially, Dalton's practiced charm seemed to work. He apologized in broken Spanish and English, claiming he was just throwing away trash. A U.S. diplomat appeared, recognized the man as an American, and called the U.S. Embassy for assistance. But then, Dalton's panicked gesture caused a half-smoked marijuana joint to fall from his clothing. Any hope of his day improving instantly vanished. Dalton was taken to a Mexico City police station where his real nightmare began. Believing they had a terrorist suspect, hours of questioning turned into days, and the interrogation methods grew increasingly brutal. By the third day of beatings and sleep deprivation, Dalton finally broke. He confessed to the espionage operation and named his partner in crime Chris. He claimed they were part of a CIA disinformation operation, a feeble attempt to save his life and position himself as a patriot rather than a traitor. Instead of local prosecution, Mexican officials decided to deport Dalton. A week later, 3 FBI agents were waiting at Los Angeles International Airport to take him into custody. During processing at FBI headquarters, Dalton was presented with a typed confession based on the statement he gave to Mexican police. Still hoping his CIA cover story might offer protection, he signed the document detailing meeting locations, document transfers, and payments received. With this confession, FBI agents immediately planned to arrest Christopher Boyce. What began as a simple drug bust had exposed one of the most significant intelligence breaches in U.S. Cold War history. For Dalton, now facing espionage charges that could carry the death penalty, the reality was sinking in. His talent for talking his way out of trouble had finally failed him completely. Legal and political consequences. On January 16, 1977, FBI agents surrounded Christopher Boyce's isolated home on a turkey ranch in rural Riverside County. They arrested him without incident as he returned from a falcon trapping trip. At FBI headquarters in Los Angeles, Chris also gave a confession. He described the lax security at TRW, his political frustrations, and Dalton's role in the conspiracy. He portrayed Dalton as a con man who had manipulated and lied to him while depicting himself as merely a misguided adventurer. The arrest naturally made national news, generating public bewilderment about how two young men from such privileged backgrounds could choose Soviet espionage as a life path. Within 2 weeks, both faced federal indictments on 8 counts of espionage and conspiracy. With the confessions, the case should have been open and shut, but it wasn't. Dalton maintained he was acting as a CIA subcontractor in a disinformation campaign. Meanwhile, Chris claimed he was blackmailed by Dalton, who threatened to expose him to his FBI father. After failed plea negotiations, the matter had to proceed to trial. Here, the U.S. government faced a dilemma. Securing convictions meant potentially revealing highly sensitive intelligence about satellite operations that had never been publicly acknowledged. Ultimately, the decision was made to proceed using only the pyramid documents as an example of the thousands of items stolen from TRW. Both trials followed a similar pattern. Christopher Boyce was convicted on April 28, 1977, after less than 4 hours of jury deliberation. Andrew Dalton Lee's conviction followed on May 12th. At age 24, Christopher Boyce received a 40-year federal prison sentence. Andrew Dalton Lee was sentenced to life in prison. Shockwaves rippled through Australian politics and U.S. intelligence after the Falcon and Snowman affair became public in Australia. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam's decision to publicly reveal the existence of previously secret U.S. listening stations and CIA funding for opposition groups created what observers called political chaos. His transparency may have contributed to his dramatic removal from office by Governor General John Kerr. Meanwhile, Boyce's courtroom testimony about U.S. manipulation of Australian labor unions sparked investigative journalism that turned into a political whirlwind. This ultimately forced both governments to renegotiate agreements about U.S. bases on Australian soil. For the U.S., the damage was even more severe. The CIA was forced to publicly acknowledge its involvement in covert satellite operations for the first time, and intelligence officials privately admitted this was one of the worst breaches in CIA history. It was the first time the KGB had genuinely penetrated U.S. surveillance satellite operations. The fallout prompted comprehensive security reforms. TRW implemented a buddy system protocol in the Black Vault. The CIA launched surprise inspections at defense contractors, and the agency accelerated the development of more advanced eavesdropping satellites. Meanwhile, the Soviets began encrypting missile test signals, effectively blinding U.S. intelligence to critical military data. What began as the betrayal of 2 young men fundamentally altered the intelligence landscape, giving Soviet intelligence intimate knowledge of America's most sensitive satellite program, while forcing a complete overhaul of how the U.S. protected its most closely guarded secrets. Post-prison journeys. Chris's incarceration began at the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in Los Angeles Harbor while he awaited sentencing. Confined to an 885-foot cell in maximum security. 24 hours a day, he spent his time reading history and doing 200 push-ups daily. But his mind was consumed with thoughts of escape. He was later transferred to the federal prison in Lompoc, where his escape plan began to take shape. He noticed a critical security flaw at the prison compound. There was a point in the secure area between the inner and outer Sallyport gates that was only fenced by a single layer of chain link. If he could climb that fence, he could largely avoid the deadly razor wire coils and escape. Inspired by the Clint Eastwood film Escape from Alcatraz, believe it or not shown during prison movie night, Chris planned his breakout. He crafted a papier-mâché head in art class, which he intended to use to fool the evening head count by apathetic night guards. With the help of a fellow inmate, Billy, he secured a maintenance crew job to access the exterior, and in broad daylight, under the watch of prison guards, was able to dig a shallow path in a drainage ditch near the perimeter fence. On January 21, 1980, Christopher Boyce emerged from the drainage ditch long after lights out. He had hidden there for hours after the final evening head count. His feet ached from hours in the cramped, tiny hole. He managed to climb the chain-link fence, and using garden shears, he stole from the prison equipment shed cut through the razor wire, blocking his path. He then dropped 10 feet to freedom, exhausted, but outside the prison perimeter. His absence that night went unnoticed as he vanished into the dark wilderness. Overnight, Boyce became the U.S. Marshal's most wanted fugitive. For the next 19 months, Boyce lived in the Southern California wilderness, using skills learned from falconry expeditions to survive. He eventually made his way to North Idaho, where he found work at a tree farm near Bonner's Ferry under the alias Jim Namchek. But this miserable existence proved insufficient for someone accustomed to comfort and ready cash. By mid-1980, Chris embarked on a new criminal career, this time as a bank robber. He reunited with a former prison mate, Kelvin Robinson, and along with brothers James and Joseph Pratt, the group robbed 16 banks across Washington and Idaho. Chris's ultimate goal remained escaping to the Soviet Union. In early 1981, he purchased a half-interest in a fishing boat, hoping to sail across the Bering Strait. When the small vessel proved unseaworthy, he moved to Port Angeles, Washington, and began learning to fly, believing he could pilot a plane to Soviet territory. Christopher Boyce's luck finally ran out on August 21, 1981. James Pratt, feeling cheated by the distribution of bank robbery proceeds, contacted the FBI hoping for a reward. After a 2-week manhunt, U.S. Marshals spotted Chris alone in a car at the Pit Stop Burger Joint in Port Angeles. He was quickly surrounded by federal agents with guns drawn and made no attempt to flee or resist. And so back to prison for Chris, who pleaded guilty to 5 bank robberies, though he likely committed more, and received a mandatory minimum of 28 years on top of his original 40-year espionage sentence. Once back behind bars, Chris was attacked by white supremacist inmates at Leavenworth, leading to his transfer to the highly restrictive federal prison in Marion, where he spent 5 years in complete isolation. In 1985, his testimony before a Senate subcommittee investigating security levels brought some concessions, including limited recreation time. The key to eventual freedom for both men was activist Kathleen Kate Mills. She read their story and chose to dedicate nearly 2 decades of her life to securing their release. Her efforts, combined with significant intervention from the original sentencing judge Robert Kelleher, led to Dalton's parole in 1998 after serving 21 years. Christopher Boyce was paroled on March 15, 2003, after serving approximately 25 years in federal prison. In October 2002, he married Kate Mills. While prosecutors at the time argued it represented one of the most damaging conspiracies in U.S. history, a 1997 Russian security memo revealed that the information Boyce and Lee provided was so worthless that no file on it exists in current Russian archives. It turns out Project Pyramid had been canceled 3 years before the documents were stolen and was no longer funded. In total, Andrew Dalton Lee received $60,000 from the Soviets, while Christopher Boyce took home just $15,000 and a small amount of cocaine. Today, both live quietly in retirement. Andrew Dalton Lee managed to kick his drug habit in prison and became a certified dental technician, but has never expressed genuine remorse for his actions, not even for drug dealing. He briefly worked as an assistant to Sean Penn after the release of the 1985 film The Falcon and the Snowman, which told his and Boyce's story. Today, he keeps a low profile living in Southern California. Christopher Boyce, off parole since 2008, lives in Oregon and has appeared in various TV interviews and occasionally posts on social media about his Falcons. Time seems to have softened his once unrepentant stance. Boyce acknowledges the naivety of choosing to wage a one-man war against U.S. intelligence power and expresses regret for his actions, particularly the bank robberies, which he describes as unforgivable. The story of the Falcon and the Snowman reveals a stark contrast between two spies. One claims he was driven by idealistic frustration, the other cynically motivated by money and drugs. Some today place Christopher Boyce in the same category as recent leakers like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. You can decide for yourself whether such individuals are heroes, traitors, or both.